Blog Talk Radio.
Live from Washington, D.C., it's Quintessential Listening, Poetry Online Radio. Now, here's your host, Dr. Michael Anthony Ingram.
Hello, everyone. My special guest today is Dr. Sam Illingworth. Dr. Illingworth is a poet, scientist who believes that poetry is a powerful tool to communicate and explore science. He is the host of the extremely popular podcast, The Poetry of Science. We're in the process of working out some technical difficulties, and we'll be right back. Hello, I just introduced you, Dr. Illingworth. How are you?
You hear me okay, Michael?
I can hear you now. Dr. Illingworth.
Great. I'm doing
Yes,
really well, thank you, Michael.
I just shared that you are a poet scientist. I'd like to know more about what that is.
Thank you, Michael. So I suppose that my work really exists between the intersections of science and poetry. And what I really enjoy doing is using poetry as a means through which to help diversify science and also to bring science to new audiences and help to develop dialogue between scientists and non-scientists through the medium of poetry. So I guess that's what I do in a relatively succinct way.
All right. Well, let's go into my famous questions. Number one being, what is poetry? And then we'll follow that up with what is science. We'll kind of split it up a little bit.
Okay. So what is poetry? So this is a question that's kind of been rattling with a lot recently because I'm just writing a book at the moment about using poetry as a method of science communication. And everybody has different definitions. For me, poetry is something that has rhythm. And you know it's a poem because when you read it, it has rhythm. And some prose has rhythm, of course, but you can't have a poem without them. And for me, I think that's the most inclusive definition I've come up with that includes poetry and hopefully enables people who write poetry to be included within that umbrella.
All right. And science, and I know that's a broad question, but as you think about science in relation to poetry, what is science?
So I would say science is really questioning the world around us and the way in which we live and coming up with methodologies to potentially answer those questions and provide new knowledge. I think that's probably the broad definition of science that I'd be comfortable with.
All right, very nice. So you've been able to craft the two together. Tell me about that process.
So for me, science is this incredible thing, okay? And I'm a very privileged, I'm a heterosexual male who's had all of the advantages that life could afford him. And I find science to be a very empowering and enabling gift. And it makes me sad that other people don't have the access to that for many different reasons. So for me, my work is concerned with having to give voice to underserved audiences and to help make science accessible to people. And poetry is a fabulous medium through which voices and to help introduce science to new audiences. Science communication is from dissemination through dialogue. And poetry really offers an opportunity to introduce people to new scientific research, but it also creates a opportunity through which dialogue can be created, the result of which is scientific discourse can be diversified. People can hopefully realize that science and poetry are both for them and can be done by them as well.
Wow, fascinating. Fascinating. What are some of the predominant themes of your work, Dr. Illingworth? You talked about working with the... Yes. I'm listening.
The thing of my work really are trying to poetry to interrogate science and also use poetry to platform different voices. So I do many projects, I guess, but one of my projects is my blog, The Poetry of Science, and my company podcast, The Poetry of Science. And every week I write a piece of new scientific research and then write a poem about it, not in a didactic way to explain the research, but rather in a way to interrogate the research, reframe it, and introduce it to audiences who might not ordinarily have seen it, not just because it's funny and scary and strange. And the other side of the work that I do is really running poetry workshops and creating opportunities for scientists and non-scientists to speak together, to share their experience, their knowledge, their tacit information, and for those sharing of experiences to lead to new scientific discourse and also an improvement for the conditions of the people that are engaged in those workshops.
Oh, wow, incredible. It sounds like you're doing great work.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think, as it's really evident from your podcast, Michael, of which I'm a big fan, you know, poetry is so important to you, clearly, and to many of the people being on your podcast. And poetry, for me, is a fundamental of my soul. And again, I'm privileged to have been introduced to poetry and to have been welcomed into the spoken word community and to have that. And people have access to poetry, and that people are shown poetry that is exclusionary. So for me, I would just have to be able to work with people that they can engage with.
Unfortunately, I cannot hear anything that you're saying anymore. Not at all.
Well, can you hear me now?
Call in again, please, sir. All right? Let's try this one more time.
I'll call again. I'll call in again. 1 second.
All right. As we're noticing here, the technology gods are not working with us today, but we're going to make this happen one way or another, even if it means we need to reschedule, because Dr. Illingworth's work is incredible. He reminds me of myself during my early years when I attempted to bridge the gap between counseling and poetry, and how exciting that was. So here we go again with Dr. Illingworth. All right.
Oh, thank
Dr.
you,
Illingworth. Oh, yes. We'll keep trying. Like I say again, if we can't make it through today, we're going to reschedule this, because what you're doing is like I said again, is incredible. I just made this statement that reminded me of myself years ago before I was tenured and promoted to an associate professor. I, too, attempted to bridge the gap between counseling and poetry in a non-traditional way, in a field that was not in English. It was in the field of counseling, totally. So I get what you're doing, and I like it.
Oh, thank you, Michael. That means a good deal coming from you.
Yes, I really, I've been reading about you. I've been reading about you all day long, and even before today. So please share a poem.
Okay. About poem. So this is a poem. This is a poem that's called Shadow Losses. So I'll read the poem, I'll say when the poem is finished, and I'll explain a little bit about the context of the poem. I don't have free time. I felt compelled to refrain from complaining about doing schoolwork, about loss of income, about living alone. My loss could be worse. I sometimes feel guilty for even comparing to those who have experienced the death of loved ones. I have to remind myself that my problems are real, my feelings are valid, my pain does matter. Still trying to give myself the permission and room to grieve losses. So that's the end of the poem, and that poem is inspired by a recent piece of research which has investigated how people are during the COVID-19 pandemic. This was an amazing piece of research done by some American scientists who asked their undergraduate students to write about their experience, the first experiences of loss and grief with COVID-19. And while some of them spoke about the loss of a family member, a lot of them spoke about this thing called shadow losses. So this idea of a loss that isn't a death, it's maybe the loss of a connection, or the loss of being able to go to a wedding, or being able to hang out with your friends. And this research was really amazing because it kind of gave voice to those shadow losses and helped the students to realise that actually it's okay to grieve these, and the loss that you're going through is just different to the loss of a family member. So I thought it was pretty amazing research, and I just wanted to be able to share it with a wide audience. That particular poem, actually, all of the words came from the participant responses that was in the original research, and I just reordered them in a processed, poetic transcription. So it was the voices of those young adults describing how they were affected by shadow losses.
When I read that poem earlier today, and actually when you sent it to me, I was really struck by it because I felt like, Michael, this is your story. This is how you feel. How can you feel anything when there are people who are really suffering, or what I felt was suffering from the pandemic, through death, through other kinds of means? So it really struck me. So I appreciated reading it. I really, really did.
Thank you, Mike. And I think this on shadow losses in COVID and beyond is really important, because so many of us excuse our feelings and try to denigrate them and make them little, whereas it's very relative, and it's okay for us to grieve these losses, and it's okay for us to acknowledge that even though someone hasn't died, we lost a part of ourselves that we'll never take back. For me, it was really profound research, and similarly to you, it spoke to me on a pretty fundamental level.
Now, do you think that someone can be called a poet if they don't feel strong emotions? I really want your answer on this one, because you're in science, which is hard facts. What does emotions have to do with it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll answer it quite particularly by giving you an answer to a question that you didn't ask. But one of the real problems with science is when science is communicated, it actually shouldn't necessarily be objective, because if I'm talking about, my background's a climate change researcher, if I'm talking about climate change, how do I talk about research without being angry or upset or frustrated or scared? And when scientists present their work as a cold fact, they put up a bridge between them and society, which basically encourages all kinds of people to kind of go against science. And actually what people should be doing is when they're talking about science, they should be able to explore their emotions. When you're doing the research, make sure that it's very objective, but when you're talking about it, it's okay to be angry or happy or sad or elated. And doing so, I think, really helps fundamentally bridge the gap between science and the wider society. To answer your original question, I think for me, being a poet is a really difficult, and it's something that I've struggled with myself. I call myself a poet. I don't know, but I try to say to everybody who I work with that if you read a poem, you're a poet.
Wow. Dr. Illingworth, do you come from a literary background? And if so, what did you learn about writing growing up?
So, background really has always been very science-based, like through school. I was always interested in the creative arts. I was obviously in a band and wrote songs. And then when I was at university, I was president of my theatre society. But the problem in the United Kingdom is kind of forced down one particular route of education from an early age. Kind of pick what majors are going to be in college by like the time you're 40, really. So I was ushered very much on this science route, but creative outlets. And I feel really privileged to be in a position now where I'm able to use that creativity to help science to different audiences. And whilst I wouldn't profess to be a amazingly talented poet, what I think I do have is an understanding of both the sciences and literature to be able to help break down some of those barriers to entry so that other people who are far more talented than me can flourish and can experience those two life worlds for themselves.
All right. As we think about your background, what was an early experience where you learned that poetic language had power?
Wow. Probably an early experience when I learned that poetic language had power would be listening to my mum recite poetry, and I guess it was my mum doesn't necessarily. She's a very intelligent woman, but she learnt so much poetry by rote at school. So I'm 37, mum's in her early 60s, and we don't really do that anymore, but just being able to listen to her recite it, that ability to poems that you learned when you were 9, 10, 11 to be really powerful. There's something in this for them to be learned in such a fashion.
Please share another poem.
Okay, great. I'll read another poem to you. So, let me read this to you. So this is words. I'll read the poem and then I'll explain. So this poem is called 15 Pounds in Spring. Dawn breaks with the diminishing sound of forced retreat. A course constrained by pair and calendar. Community trace this diminuendo of diversity, captured by acoustic accoutrements to forecast future soundscapes stripped clean of tone and pitch and voice. The impending silence scored by our extinction of experience. So that's the end of the poem. And this poem is inspired by recent research which has found that the sounds of spring are actually changing. Dawn choruses across America and Europe becoming quieter and less varied. So there's this really sad phenomenon called the extinction experience, which is about the loss of human interactions. And loss of human interactions is really catastrophic for two reasons. Because one, it reduces the health and well-being that human beings can get from their connection with nature, and two, by connecting with nature, it also means that humans are far less likely to develop policy and take action to help protect biodiversity in nature. So for me, this phenomenal research, right? The researchers looked at annual bird count data for more than 200,000 sites across America and Europe from 1996 to 2018, and combined them with an online database of and just found that the diversity of sounds in spring have changed, and it's interesting. And I had to be really sad that we completely lost this soundscape, and hope we can get it back.
Wow. Let's take a brief break, and we'll be right back. I'm here with Dr. Sam Illingworth. We are back. I am Michael Anthony Ingram. I'm here with Dr. Sam Illingworth, the amazing Dr. Sam Illingworth. Let me ask you, does writing energize or exhaust you?
It massively energizes me. So, I mean, I write at least a poem every week. I write at Michael, I tend to write in nature. So part of the reason because the internet is because I live really remotely, which is amazing. And I go for a walk and write poetry, and that reconnection, in contrast to the previous topic we were discussing, is really valuable for me. And yeah, I get a buzz, definitely.
Do you think you were meant to be a poet?
Oh, well, I do very much believe fate and destiny. Like I'm a Christian. It's part of my identity. And I think that, yeah, even though I still struggle with calling myself a poet, Michael, I think that it is something I'm destined to do, and something which I feel incredibly privileged to be able to call myself.
Wow, very nice. Very, very nice. Please share another poem.
Okay. My call is called Volcanic Seas, so I'll read it and then I'll explain it again. Four seas break your skin, fabricated fractures feeding flare up with deferred certainties that linger in the tuff. Wearing wealth like a crown, you proudly pronounce the word wounds of every. Lean back your past, we scour through scars with measured respect, bearing them as witness against the rising tides. A sunken circle, mark, cracked echo of history. the end of the poem, and this poem is inspired by research which has found that sea levels have on the Greek island Santorini. So what's basically been found that although sea levels are changing, as the sea levels change, it actually affects the way in which volcanoes can erupt. So rising sea levels in this particular instance in the ancient sinking sea level cause it to erupt more. I just think this is the kind of beautiful dance and synergy of the earth in motion, almost magical breath, if you will, of the oceans going in and out and the volcanoes responding in turn. Yeah, so pretty cool research.
Who else is doing this, Dr. Illingworth? I want to know. Have you cornered the market in terms of what you're doing? I mean, are there other colleagues out there going yes, let's do this?
Well,
I want to know.
I hope so, Mike. No, I hope so, Mike. Honestly, one of the things that I wanted to do, I've done my blog for about 6 years.
Okay.
A couple of years. I love doing it, but I also thinking to myself, I'm really sustainable. Like, it's only one person, so I set up a couple of years ago the Poetry and Science Journal Concilius, which creates a space for people to publish poetry related to science. And Michael, it's one of the proudest things I've ever done. So as well as publishing the work of about 100 odd poets, we also have a volunteering team on the Concilius board of 76 members from 6 continents and 12 countries. And all these people are passionate about the intersection of science and poetry and just helping to establish a community and, dare I say, movement in using poetry to help diversify science and to really just explore the idea of poetry and science and not mutually exclusive entities, but rather complementary pieces of the same jigsaw.
Tell me about your book, A Sonnet to Science. I found that fascinating as well.
Okay, so A Sonnet to Science is a book I wrote a couple of years ago, which looks at the life and work of 6 well-known scientists and the role that poetry played in research and life. So people like Humphrey Davy, people like Ada Lovelace, the people we've heard of, but then also people like Ronald Ross, who was the person who discovered the link between malaria and mosquitoes and won a Nobel Prize for it. He actually recorded when he made that link. He didn't write it down in the scientific article, Michael. The first thing he wrote was a poem to record the link, which I found to be astounding. Also, people like Rebecca Edson and Miroslav Volov, who are more modern poets. Rebecca Elson's work in particular I find to be very important. She was one of the first people to work on the Hubble-based telescope and wrote poetry that explored space, but space at such an incredible scale, from the cells in our body to the multiple galaxies that exist. So in writing that book, what I really found was that poetry for all of these scientists offered a way for them to make sense of the world that had to complement the scientific study. And I'm not saying that they wouldn't have been able to do their scientific research without poetry. What I am saying is that poetry was a vital part of their lives that had to make them the people that they were.
Yeah, I'm just amazed. I'm just amazed. I'm really glad you're with me today. Please share another poem.
Okay, Carl, I'll share another poem with you. It's such a pleasure to be able to read my poems like this as well. I really appreciate it. So I'm just going to read a poem to you now. I'm going to be a bit more positive, Michael. So I'll read the poem and then I'll explain it. This is called Majestic Migration. Cloud colour sail on ocean winds, dancing over dunes like burnished memories of distant verdant lands, flying, dying, promise of return passed on through generations, whispered reveries amongst rosy orange mists of elongated time. So that's the end of the poem. And this poem is inspired by research, which is really cool. This is that the painted lady butterflies actually achieve the longest known insect migration from the Sahara Desert all the way to Europe. They do it as they're migrating, they mate and they give birth. So that the ones that are off in the Sahara Desert are not the same butterflies that end up in Europe. They've passed on the genetic memory to their offspring, which I just found to be incredible.
You know, it's funny. I do have one more question about a sonnet to science. If you were if you had to convince a friend or colleague to read that particular book, what would you tell them?
Oh, well, I'm British, Michael, so I'm very self-effacing in my own work, but if I was trying to convince them to read the book, what I would do is I'd say, read this book as demonstration that human beings are not readily put in pigeons for other people. We are not poets, we are not scientists, we are not dancers, we are not artists, we are not builders, we are not doctors, we are not nurses. We are human beings with an infinite potential to shape the world around us.
Wow. That was truly nicely stated. I like that. I like that. You know, you speak so distinctively. What is the relationship between your speaking voice and your written voice?
Oh, Michael, you're asking really insightful questions that are really important to me as well. So for me,
I'm glad.
The way that when I'm doing basic poetry workshops with people, I always give them poems and ask them to read them in their head and then to read them out loud and to hear other people read them out loud because they sound completely different. And to me, there's a cadence in the way that you read poetry. I love reading poetry. I love being a spoken word artist. But I think that it's okay when you write a poem for that poem to function as a written piece. It's okay when you write a poem for that to function as a spoken piece. And it's okay to function as both or indeed neither. Like personally, when I write poetry, I'm normally writing it to be read by somebody else. And I don't specifically write some poetry, rather the way in which I perform slam poetry. I'd use the same words, but maybe alter my cadence or the way in which it was delivered.
You could be my twin, because I feel the exact same way. Wow, this is too much for me today. All right. All great writers have great writing influences. Who are some of yours, and what makes them special in your eyes?
Okay, it's a really good question. Michael, can I be honest and tell you that mine changed quite a lot? Somebody who's probably had the most profound impact on me recently is Claudia Rankine. When I read Citizen, an American Lyric, it blew my mind. It kind of showed me what poetry can achieve, and it reminded me of the Shelley quote where he talks about poetry being a mirror that you hold up to society, right? And what Claudia shows us in her work is that actually me, that mirror, sometimes when we look at that reflection, not a pretty sight, but we need to look. And poetry has an amazing ability to make us look and make us question why things are the state that they are. And so her work, more than any others, and that piece in particular, I found to be incredibly aspirational and is something I would aspire to be able to write one of the sentences in that book.
You know, your poems have really detailed titles. What role should a title play in a poem?
Michael, I used to find writing titles really hard, and I got a really cool piece of advice from a fellow poet, and he told me, title needs to tell you something that the poem does not. And the way I interpret that is, if my poem is very literal, I'll make the title metaphorical. If my poem is very metaphorical, I'll make the title quite literal. So I used to always do that. If the first line would be the title of the poem, or the last line would be, but now I try the title to offer something different to the reader because of that great advice I got.
Oh, very nice, very nice. Poets hail from all over the world. Where do you hail from, and how has that experience shaped your writing?
Okay, so I'm British, as you can tell, and I'm from the North of England. So traditionally the North of England would be seen as being more working class and less severe the South of England. I'm from a posh middle-class town in the North of England, Harrogate. So I'm actually very oxymoronic. I've lived and worked all over the world, from Japan through to America, through to
Australia, I believe too, right?
To Australia as well, right? And even though I can't speak another language fluently, I think living in those different cultures, what it's shown me is that the words of the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein hold so true. Those words are that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And I don't just mean the language that you speak, I mean cultural language, everything. And for me, being able to live in different communities and with different people, different cultures, has a profound influence on who I am, on acknowledging my own place, acknowledging my own privilege, and acknowledging the potential that I can have to hopefully be for a good world as well.
You know, it's funny. There's so much, maybe it's not funny, but there's so much happening in this world, and you talked about different people, different cultures, you talked about climate change. What do you view as being the role of a poet in modern-day society?
But I think it's a little bit like I was talking earlier, Michael. It's about holding up a mirror to society and making us look, even if we don't want to look. And it's about helping. For me as well, I think it's about helping people, especially those who've been denied a voice, to find a voice. And for the people who don't have a voice, it's to use their words to help find that voice. And I think that's what poetry can do and should do.
Wow. But does it do it, Dr. Illingworth? Does it do it? Tell me. I want to know. I have an inquiring mind.
Does it do it? I think it depends on the poet, Michael. I think there's some amazing people out there doing some incredible work. And I'm not saying they have to be civil activists leading workshops, because they could just be a person in home that gives voice to those concepts. I think that poetry has the capacity to do that, providing, of course, that it moves to from people gazing exclusive history, instead adopts a direction in which all voices are welcome.
All right. Please share another poem.
Okay, let me share another poem with you. Okay, cool. So this poem, I'll read the poem and I'll explain the research. So this poem is called A Bronze Map of Stone. In balmy earth, your chiseled contours lay dormant in another's chamber. Rivulets in rock congealed with dampened soil until we break you free and into pieces. Running wrinkled fingers along their channels with scry for secrets between your boundaries. Trading burials as we leave you to rest beneath the edges of your distant kingdom. Wordlessly you call to us, triumphant topographies proclaiming all that you once were. Proud motifs mark a fate now lost amongst the landscape you no longer are. So that's the end of the poem, and the poem's by research which recently found a 4,000-year-old stone slab, which is thought to be Europe's oldest map. It was just found in like a boat in a castle, and this area in like the western France in Brittany, and it's just this beautiful like 3D map of the area, and I just thought it was incredible and like a beautiful connection to our past.
Wow. I'm really enjoying talking to you. I really, really am. I wish I'd met you prior to my retirement because I love working with individuals who work in interdisciplinary ways. Well, let's Michael, take a brief break and we'll be right back. You going to say something?
I was just going to say we can still work with Michael. You're working, we can collaborate together.
Okay. All right. I like that. We'll be right back. Dr. Sam Illingworth. Dr. Sam, question for you.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. They say that to see the world with complete honesty, one should look to comedians, musicians, artists, and poets. What do you think emerges naturally from your work? What emerges from you, Dr. Sam?
I think the book that emerges to me, Michael, is the voice of others. A lot of poems that I've been reading, obviously, my interpretation of other people's research. A lot of my research involves running collaborative poetry workshops with marginalised communities, helping them to explore their attitude towards science and their disconnect with it. But I think the work that emerges from my work is that these communities are important, not only because it's important ethically that we give them voice, or because science is a series of global interdisciplinary problems, and the only way we'll solve them is not in a bunch of people that like to really talk about it, but in a group of diverse backgrounds bringing their own experience to solve them. And I hope work that I do demonstrate to others that these are the communities we should be engaging with in order to diversify and make more effective our attitude towards scientific discourse.
Now, let's say they're teaching a workshop, and I've taught many in my time. How long does it take you to win them over with your concept?
Well, Michael, it really depends on the work, right? You must know that. So I remember, I went an Englishman, Michael, and the flamboyant, and I am going into Scottish. There's a long history between Scotland, and I was got to prison, and I was asked to run a 3-hour workshop on writing poems about science. I turned up, Michael, in salmon trousers, white wing cuppers, and a burgundy bow tie.
I know you like your bow tie.
Oh yeah,
you like your bow tie.
I like my bow tie, and you know what? And like for me, audience in particular, that's an audience who's been denied opportunities, and just any engagement is useful to them. But at the same time, that audience very much sees through falsities. So I think being true to yourself and to your audience, and listening to their needs. I always think, Michael, you should ask people's needs rather than assume what they want. And I think doing that is a really effective way. People sometimes must not like my workshop, but what I always tend to do is say at the start, look, if we do something we don't like, we change it. It is for you, not for just me. And I think I'm experienced enough facilitator to be able to react to things on the fly, and to listen to my audience's needs rather than just treat them as a singularity.
All right. It's funny. I walked into many forums where I felt initially that the audience chuckled at me as I talked about my beliefs. But as we continued our journey together, they chuckled with me as we processed and we grew and we developed together. So I do understand. It takes a minute. When you think about writing a poem, and you've written many, some poets claim that a poem is like a living creature. Once it's out there, there's not much you can do to correct or improve it, while others edit meticulously, not leaving much from the original draft form. What is your take on it, Sam?
Definitely of the former, Michael. And like for me as well, especially with the work I do on poetic transcription, Michael, that's just interpretation. Like, I would love people to take those poems, to make their own, to adapt them, to change them, give me feedback, to use it themselves. Like however they want to use it, if it's, I don't know, to scream out with profanities, that's cool. Like, words that I've made and that I've shared and that people can do with what they want. And for me, I don't think there's such thing as a finished poem. There's just a moment in time in which that poem exists before it moves on to the next one.
We have time for a few more poems. Please favor us again.
Okay, Michael, so this poem's called Wailing Away. In the name of progress, we pour your honey liquor down the jagged throats of our unquenchable machines. Launch broken vessels, coax you from the depths of your unnumbered slumber. Surrounded by our wooden belts, you congregate in immensity, striking the surface with frenzied flukes to tear waves from their moorings. A futile display of decay paints rounded targets for warm-blooded killers rise from the spray. Bloodied, bruised, broken, you flee from hubris to the undying night of the ocean's floor. Seeking comfort, you see faded fardor, mourning your loss, for others to learn. So that's the end of the poem. And this poem, Michael, was inspired by the most incredible research which found that sperm whales actually shared behaviors to outmaneuver 19th century human hunters. So the sperm whales learned how to evade humans with harpoons, and they taught this behavior to other sperm whales so they could learn the same thing, which I found to be incredible. Like, not only the fact that it happened, but we were able to work out that this happened as well.
Wow. Sperm whales. Wow. It sounds like you never suffer to find topics.
Oh, my, honestly, so much. Like, this is what I love about science, though, Michael, and like what I want other people to love, that it's everywhere. It's everywhere, and it's beautiful, and it's bold, and it's brilliant, and it's terrifying, and it's hilarious, and just, I would love people to have poetry in their lives. I really want people to have science in their lives as well, because it's amazing.
Wow, very nice. Share another, please.
Okay, so this song, this poem, sorry, is called Ancient Shell Sounds. Abandoned at the mouth of your shelter, you quivered apprehensively at our approach. Crying out to be held, we proclaimed the exception of your discovery, sighing wearily as we consigned you to the dusty silence of our archives. But now, when I hold you in my hands, I see the face of your purposefully freckled complexion. When I lift you to my ear, I hear the sound of an ancient sea lapping at your shores. When I place you at my lips, I feel the heartbeat of your creator pulsing to my breath. I close my eyes as you call out to all that you have lost. And that's the end of the poem, and the poem is inspired by recent research which discovered a large seashell that had sat in a French museum for decades, and people weren't entirely sure what it was. Turns out it was a musical instrument used around 18,000 years ago, but in the French Pyrenees. And I love the idea that there was this seashell that people thought, oh, that looks nice, and it turned out that it was this incredibly important instrument for like rituals. And the cool thing about this is, right, these researchers, they hired a professional horn player, and they put a horn piece in the end of the shell, and he blew and made music with it. So they were able to create the same music that would have been heard by our ancestors almost 20,000 years ago, which I just find to be astounding.
Wow. Tell me about your podcast.
Thanks, Michael. So I have a podcast called The Poetry of Science, and every week I write a poem about science, research some of those examples I've heard, and then I read a poem and give an explanation of the science, and then I read the poem again to help you. Basically, I think when you're making sense, having additional context can help. So I do that, and then I also try to read a poem by another poet on a similar topic. I love doing that because it expands my poetic knowledge, and also hopefully demonstrate to people that poetry comes in all shapes and matters, and is a really wide church that is absolutely for everybody. So you can check out my podcast, Poetry of Science. It comes out every Monday. It's available at all podcast directories. They're short episodes, Mike. They're only about 7-8 minutes. I'd for people to listen to it, follow my work, and to get in touch if anything that I've said has resonated with them.
Yes. How long have you been on the air?
We've been there I've been on air with the Poetry of Science for about 2 years now.
Okay. Beautiful. Beautiful. Wow. You are an amazing man, Dr. Illingworth.
Thank you, Michael. That's very kind of you to say so.
Well, it's true. What have you learned about yourself being a poet scientist? What have you learned about yourself?
I think, yeah, that's a really good question. I think I've learned my limitations, Michael. Like, I think growing up, I always thought I was going to be kind of a Nobel Prize scientist, and I don't think that would be the case. And I thought I was going to be a Hollywood actor, and I think that's going to be the case. But what I do have is I get to do a job where I have my two things that I love in life, as well as my family and God, like combined into practice. And I feel very blessed to be able to do that. I think that in acknowledging my own limitations, I also know that something I am very good at is facilitating the work of others and helping to use my voice to help others with theirs. And I think that in poetry and science, there's space, there's a need for that, Michael, and I feel grateful that I've been able to contribute towards that way.
Wow, very nice. What is next for you creatively?
So creatively for me, Michael, next, I would love to eventually have a manuscript published. I mean, I have my blog, and my blog is read by tens of thousands of people a year, which is amazing. But part of me would still like them. I've got like a chapbook and poems in anthologies and things, but I'd like a collection. But I think that's probably to me being vain, Michael. Like, I think I need one.
We've almost come to the end of our journey, but I'd like you to read one last poem before we go, if that's okay.
Of course, Michael. So I'm just going to read a song to you now, and this is called Seismic Songs. Just actually, I'll give you context first. So this is basically about new research which has discovered how whale song echoes can actually be used to map the ocean floor. So we listen to the echoes of whale song, and we use this to create a visual map of what lies beneath us. This is called Seismic Songs. An accidental echo of a line oscillates with the baritone or misplaced song. Waves beneath waves, burst wires crossed with the rising conductors from baton. The reflected signals of your chorus reverberate throughout the deep, exchanging tones with every passing crescendo, as your harmony silence our ordinance with a resonance. And that's the end of the poem, Michael. Thank you.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had an opportunity today, or this evening, to hear from the brilliant Dr. Sam Illingworth. I want to thank you so much, sir, for spending time with me. I'm so glad we've made this connection. I wish you nothing but
Michael.
the best. And I champion all that you do.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Yes. Well, to our listening audience, I say thank you, as usual. I wish you well. And as I share every week, let poetry ring. Good night, good morning, wherever you are, take care of yourselves. All right.
You have just listened to the Quintessential Listening Poetry Online Radio Podcast with your host, Dr. Michael Anthony Ingram. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher. And make sure to catch our next episode.